This is Business Incorporated. Thank you for joining us. I'm Chimezi Obi Iwago. On the show today, BRICS Bank to lend up to $780 million to South Africa's Eskom. IMF urges South Sudan to stop taking oil-backed loans. Plus, Egypt and Nissan agree to produce 100,000 cars a year. First, the markets. And major markets here in Africa were mostly down at intraday, except Egypt, where the index was up 0.71%. The JSE index in South Africa was down 0.30%, while the consumer goods counter on the Nigerian Stock Exchange dragged the index down 0.11%. Kenya closed in the green on Tuesday. And in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia's stock market dropped on Wednesday as its banks fell, while most major Gulf markets saw gains, mirroring global cues ahead of a decision by the U.S. Federal Reserve on its interest rate plans for the year. Saudi's index fell 0.17% from the multi-year closing high it hit after entering FTSE Russell's emerging market index on Monday. The Abu Dhabi index inched up 0.37%, with Waha Capital adding 3.1% and RAK Properties rising 3%, while Qatar's index was up 0.20%. In Dubai, the index gained 0.09%. And in Europe, stocks were lower in the morning as investors awaited a policy decision by the U.S. Federal Reserve. Aside from Fed's decisions, there are other stories driving markets sentiment. Let's talk to Conrad. Hello, Conrad. A very good afternoon to you today.
Good afternoon from Frankfurt. Thanks for having me back on Channels TV, Jimmy.
So tell me, Conrad, let's begin with this interesting but not exciting news about drug and chemicals maker Bayer Monsanto. The company got a blow from California, where a jury ruled that the weed killer Roundup has caused cancer. What's the market reaction and how bad can this get for the German company?
Jimmy, Bayer's shares have lost more than 12% in the trading session here in Frankfurt today, which indicates quite clearly how bad investors think this can become for Bayer. We have to take into consideration that this case in California is a so-called bellwether case. We're not only talking about one case, about one man who got cancer because he used Roundup. That's according to the conviction of, all of the members of the jury in this courtroom. We are also talking about more than 700 more files, 700 more cases on the table of this judge in San Francisco. All of those cases are gardeners and farmers in the United States suing Bayer. And on top of this, there are 11,000 cases pending in all of the United States against Bayer or Bayer Monsanto, because they are all about the potentially causing of cancer of this weed killer Roundup. That's enormous, and of course that explains why the stock market reaction is so negative. Remember, we had this case last year, the first case where in America the judge said, one judge said that Bayer was to pay an amount of more than $200 million in damages. That amount was reduced later to $78 million. But if you multiply this sum alone with all the cases outstanding, you see how big the damage for Bayer can eventually become.
Well, FOMC meeting ends today, and Powell is expected to address the public later today. Now, aside from the FOMC meeting, what else is driving markets?
Well, we have a number of company reports out. BMW, for example, came out with a profit warning. It announced significant cost cuts of up to 12 billion euros. That's far more cost cuts than an average, a majority of analysts had anticipated. And that's why it's a bit of a shocker for investors. BMW shares are down 5%. Google is in focus today, of course, here in Europe, because the European Commission fined Google again. It has to pay a fine of 1.5 billion euros. The anti-competitive or the competition watchdogs of the EU Commission are convinced that Google treated the market unfairly with its service AdSense for search, which allows websites to include Google search in their websites. Of course, Google wants to challenge this decision. The stock price reaction of Google here in Europe, at least, is not negative, also because of the news that Google has announced a video game streaming service called Stadia, which is expected to be launched later this year. This could be very disruptive for the computer games industry. Both Sony and Nintendo's shares have lost significantly in Asian trading. In terms of the Federal Reserve, well, there is some potential for disappointment, I have to say. A small majority of market participants have priced in another rate cut later this year if the Fed gives any indication today that this rate cut is not going to happen in the course of this year. Then, of course, some profit-taking might be happening on the equity markets tomorrow. Remember, yesterday the German DAX climbed on the highest level in 5 months, so there's room for some profit-taking, I would say.
Well, you talked about EU Commission fining Google. Now, EU Commission chief is being criticized for remarks about free ports where rich collectors can store art duty and tax-free. What's going on there? What has he said, and why is he being criticized?
Well, Mr. Juncker is criticized for not taking the free ports too seriously. The statement by Mr. Juncker's spokesperson was that Juncker had personally and tirelessly pursued an agenda against money laundering and tax evasion. And in a response to members of the European Parliament, the Commission spokesman praised the advantages of free ports as useful to simplify commercial operations. And he said that no evidence was out there showing that free zones in the European Union were systemically used to commit fraud. Now, the members of Parliament who went to see a couple of those free ports completely think otherwise. They, for example, visited a free port in Luxembourg, which was installed in the country while Jean-Claude Juncker was the prime minister there. The name of this free port is nicely said in French, Le Free-Port. And, well, the members of Parliament say that free ports could enable money laundering because they circumvent the normal international rules on transparency. And I brought you another quote from one of the members of Parliament, Ana Maria Gomez, who's in the European Parliament for the Socialist Social Democratic faction. She says, this is a way that could easily be used to store goods away from anybody's control for putting them in the dark when it's more convenient, avoiding tax. Another member of this equipe, of this team of members of Parliament that checked out the free ports, Mr. Wolf Klinz, who's a member of the Liberal Party, is certainly not a party that's, famous for being too critical of free markets. He says that obviously Jean-Claude Juncker has not taken seriously why the members of Parliament have contacted him. Remember, those free ports, they are used to store goods like artworks without paying import taxes, without paying VAT, without, decent monitoring. Of course, they are rumored to help rich, cosmopolitan billionaires to store their goods without, declaring them to the authorities.
All right, thank you very much for your time, Conrad. Let's listen to Powell later today and hear what he's going to say to us. Thank you for your time. And shares in major Asian stock markets mostly slipped today following a series of conflicting reports on U.S.-China trade that surfaced overnight. The mainland Chinese markets recovered partially from their earlier losses, but still ended their trading day lower, with the Shenzhen Composite shedding 0.248%. The Shanghai Composite closed mostly flat at 3,090.64. In Hong Kong, the Hang Seng Index declined 0.33% in its final hour of trading. Over in South Korea, the Kospi closed largely flat at 2,177 as chipmaker SK Hynix jumped 3.68%. In Australia, the ASX 200 closed 0.32%. The Nikkei 225 in Japan bucked the overall trend as it closed 0.2%. The Topix index ended its trading day 0.26% higher at 1,614.39. And U.S. stock index futures barely moved as investors await a policy decision by the U.S. Federal Reserve. At about 7 a.m. Eastern Time, Dow futures pointed to a drop of less than 20 points at the open. Futures in S&P 500 and Nasdaq were little changed. Market focus is largely attuned to global trade developments amid media reports of U.S. concerns that China is pushing back against American demands in trade talks. Meanwhile, the U.S. Central Bank is widely expected to keep rates steady later in the session, with investors monitoring a decision on the Fed's rate projections for the next few years. No economic data are expected today. However, on the earnings front, General Mills is set to report its results before the bell, and Williams-Sonoma will report after the bell. And away from the equities market and back here in Africa, Morocco's central bank on Tuesday left its benchmark interest rate flat at 2.25%, saying the decision was in line with the inflation and growth outlook. Inflation, driven mainly by food prices, was seen dipping to 0.6% in 2019 from 1.9% in 2018, before picking up to 1.1% in 2020. The bank expects Morocco's budget deficit to widen to 4.1% in 2019, excluding privatization revenue, from 3.7% last year. The forecast is higher than the government's expectations of 3.7% and 3.3%, including privatization revenue. And the International Monetary Fund has asked the government of South Sudan to stop selling expensive and opaque oil advances because loan resettlements were hindering spending vital for the implementation of a peace deal. President Salva Kiir and his former deputy Riek Machar signed an accord in September halting fighting that had uprooted more than a third of the country's 12 million people. South Sudan was plunged into war in 2013 after a political disagreement between the two men, who hail from rival ethnic groups, escalated into a military confrontation. The government took out loans from several Chinese companies during the war, offering to repay them with future oil proceeds from fields that at their height pumped 350,000 barrels per day. The IMF says spending in the remaining part of the 2018-2019 fiscal year will be constrained by large repayments of oil revenue advances. The landlocked country has one of the most oil-dependent economies in the world, accounting for more than 95% of revenues. And the new development bank, backed by the BRICS nations, plans to lend as much as $780 million to South African power firm Eskom Holdings for infrastructure projects this year, as the ailing power utility battles to keep power supply steady. Eskom, which on Wednesday entered a 7th day of controlled power cuts, is contending with operational and financial challenges threatening the productivity of Africa's most industrialized economy. The government is considering various interventions to turn the company around, including a $4.8 billion bailout over 3 years and splitting the organization into 3 parts to help contain costs. The NDB, owned by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is in talks with the government about loans that could alleviate some of the pressure on the country's electricity grid. The development institution is rolling out a $180 million loan to Eskom to build transmission lines and is considering 2 further projects in 2019. Still in South Africa, the annual inflation rate rose for the first time in 3 months in February as food and transport prices increased. Consumer price growth accelerated to 4.1% from a year earlier, compared with 4% in January. South Africa's inflation rate rose for the first month in 3 in February. The South African Reserve Bank seeks to anchor inflation at the 4.5% midpoint of its target range of 3% to 6% to allow for flexibility in dealing with price shocks. The central bank lowered its 2019 inflation forecast to 4.8% in January from a previous estimate of 5.5%, largely due to lower assumed oil prices. However, higher than expected electricity tariff increases could add a further 0.3 percentage point to the forecast. We take a break, and when we return, we cross over to the Nigerian equities for an update as Diamond Bank gets delisted from the market. Do stay with us.